Hi and welcome to lecture 2. In the previous lecture, we started generating our application, the fancy cars application, and we're using the scaffolding command to put stuff into the database. But which database is Rails using? And how do you view the contents of that database? So Rails by default uses SQLite as its database engine. And SQLite is self-contained, serverless, which basically means it has no server. Whereas, for example, MySQL or Postgres or Oracle, pretty much any relational database engine out there is going to have a server. SQLite doesn't have a server. It's just a file that sits on your file system, and SQLite lets you interact with that file as if it were a real database engine. And SQLite actually is claimed to be the most widely deployed SQL database engine in the world. All these devices, Android phone, Apple phones, different browsers use SQLite to store information. So the way the database interaction is set up in Rails is that you have a config directory, which is going to be on the same level as your app directory in your Rails application. And that config directory has database.yaml file in it. And automatically, when you generate an application, Rails says, go ahead and specify that the development.sqlite3 file, which actually is located right here, is going to be used for developing your Rails application. So again, the file that says where the database is database.yaml, which is located in your config directory, but where the database is actually stored, if it's using SQLite 3 or SQLite, is going to be underneath the DB directory. So now we probably have to install some kind of a fancy tool that lets you visualize the database. Well, actually, no, we don't need to, because you could just do Rails DB if you are inside the fancy cars application, which is the Rails application we created in lecture 1. And Rails DB pops you straight into SQLite console, which tells you all the different commands available. If you do .help, it tells you all the different commands available to execute in the console to view the contents of your database. So for example, if we want to see the tables that currently exist in the database, you could do .tables, and that tells you that there's a cars table, which we know was created. There's also the schema migrations table, which we'll talk about it in a few minutes. Now, the good thing to do, at least what I find helpful, is to turn the headers on. So you do .headers on, and what this lets you do is it enables the headers, the column headers. So all these column headers, ID, make, color, year, and so on, they get enabled by doing .headers on. Without that, you actually see the content, but you don't see the column headers. Another option that I find useful to turn on is mode. So there's a default mode, whatever that is, but the mode I find useful is .mode columns, which actually displays the columns in your database table as columns. So now at this point, if you do .headers on and you do .mode columns, you're able to do select star from cars, and that lets you see the structure of a table that we created back in lecture 1. Two things to note here. There is this created at and updated at column, which we didn't really create. So where did that come from? And we'll talk about that a little later. And basically the idea is created at is a column that gets created and populated when the record is created, and updated at is a column that gets modified. So when you update a row in the database, the updated at column gets modified with a timestamp on when that column was modified. And there's also this ID column, which we didn't create. We only created make, color, and year columns, but as we're going to see, Rails, or specifically the active record, which is used to interact with the database, assumes that we obviously want to have a primary key to our table, because that is a good practice to always have a primary key pretty much all the time, to have a primary key on your database tables. So it creates a primary key called ID, and it auto increments it 1, 2, 3, and so on. To exit the SQLite console, you would do .exit, and that takes you out of the console. Now, of course, you don't have to use the Rails space DB command to view your SQLite console or your SQLite database. There are other tools out there. For example, this tool over here called SQLite Browser, which you could use to view your database. But the point is, you don't really need to install any other tools. Once you have your Rails application, you automatically have access to your SQLite schema and data in the SQLite database by doing Rails space DB. So in summary, Rails uses SQLite by default, and there is a built-in command line DB viewer to view the contents and the schema of your database. What's next? Next, we'll talk about migrations, what those are, and we're going to start getting closer and closer to the actual database. But as we're going to see, we don't have to get too close, hopefully. It's going to be mostly abstract concepts, but it's going to give you a good understanding of how the database, how the interaction with the database happens in Rails.